Hi there, my name's Keith and welcome to Keith James Green's Bible Research. In this video, I want to talk about Christ from a purely historical perspective. And I want to begin by asking a question. Did Christ really exist? Now, as far as other famous people in history, many people don't seem to have a problem believing that they existed. Whether it be Plato, who was a famous philosopher who walked the earth about 428 BC, or whether it be Hippocrates, who's said to be the father of medicine, and he lived about 460 years before Christ, or whether it be Herodotus, who is said to be the first proper historian, and he lived about 2,500 years ago in 484 BC. And of course, when it comes to Captain Cook, who only lived 300 years ago, who in his right mind would think that he didn't actually exist? And yet, when it comes to the founder of the largest religion in the world, some people are not quite sure about whether Jesus Christ actually existed. And if you were to look on the internet, you would find books that theorize that Christ was a mythical character, and that he didn't exist. And they theorize and have all sorts of ideas how this took place. Now, in this video, I want to show you that for university professors of ancient history, it's a non-issue. And the consensus is that Christ definitely existed. Now, I'm not saying that they believe that he was the Son of God, because many of those professors are not Christians, but the consensus is that Christ definitely existed. Now, the information I want to present to you tonight is taken from two books. The first one is entitled Did Jesus Exist? By Bart Ehrman, who is a professor of religious studies, and he's associated with the University of North Carolina. And the second book is entitled The Christ Files. Now, the first book was written by, as I said, Ehrman, and he describes himself not as a Christian. He said he's an agnostic with atheist leanings. But the second book, The Christ Files, was written by John Dickson, who's a professor of ancient history and associated with the Macquarie University in Sydney, and he says that he is a Christian. Now, a few years ago, I attended a lecture given by John Dickson in Perth, and during that lecture, he stated that he actually conducted a survey in which he asked professors of ancient history whether they believed that Christ existed. And he said the result was that all those that responded said that they definitely believed that Christ existed. Now, Bart Ehrman, who I said is an agnostic with atheist leanings, wrote the following on page 4 of his book. He said, "I hardly need to stress what I have already intimated. The view that Jesus existed is held by virtually every expert on the planet." Now, when he's talking about experts, he's not talking about the Christian community. He's talking about professors of ancient history, many of which are not Christians. And he goes further on to say on page 4 the following. "Serious historians of the early Christian movement, all of them have spent many years preparing to be experts in their field. It is striking that virtually everyone who spent time to attain these qualifications is convinced that Jesus Christ of Nazareth, person or figure. But the question is why? Why do professors of ancient history believe Christ really did exist? What sort of evidence do they base their conclusion upon? Well, in Dickson's book, he discusses historical evidence and states the following on page 24. Virtually nothing about the past can be proven in a mathematical sense. Historical evidence allows us to talk about probabilities rather than certainties. In many ways, it is like legal evidence. Beyond reasonable doubt does not mean certain. It means that a particular conclusion is so well supported by the evidence that to doubt it or insist on an alternate explanation is unreasonable. In other words, he's saying, for example, that you can't really prove using mathematical deductive reasoning that Captain Cook existed, but who in their right mind would doubt his existence? It's beyond reasonable doubt. Now, in regard to secular or non-religious historical evidence, Bart Ehrman and Dixon cite several examples where Christ is mentioned by ancient historians. For example, he's mentioned by Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, and he wrote extensively about many Roman emperors, and you may have even read some of his writings at high school. And he wrote his historical accounts about 85 years after Christ's death, and he wrote the following: Christians derive their name from a man called Christ, who during the reign of Emperor Tiberius had been executed by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. The deadly superstition, thus checked for the moment, broke out afresh not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world meet and become popular. So as you can see, Tacitus wasn't exactly a believer. In fact, he thought of Christianity as like a superstition and thought it was evil. And yet, he just quotes Christ in the context of being a historical figure. Now, another reference, historical reference by an ancient historian, is the writings of Josephus, who was born 6 years after Christ's death. Now, Josephus was a Jewish historian, and he wrote extensively about the history of the Jews. And he was given a position to do his work by the Roman emperor. And he actually wrote prolifically many pages and pages of history about the Jewish nation. And he mentioned Christ 2 times in 2 accounts. The first one is as follows, quote, "But this younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper, and very insolent. He assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, the so-called Messiah Christ, whose name was James, and some others. When he had formed an accusation against them, as breakers of the law, he delivered them over to be stoned to death." So here's an account where Josephus mentioned the brother of Christ. And as I said, he was not a Christian, and yet he just mentioned this because it was connected, well, for whatever reason, it was mentioned in his histories in passing. Now, there was a second time in which Josephus also mentioned Christ, and Ehrman says in this particular account, they believe that, even though they believe that the account was originally written by Josephus, they believe it was sort of touched up by Christian copyists, because obviously they're trying to, they regard Christ as the Son of God. So they believe that this account was actually a little bit embellished. So Ehrman suggests taking away the little bit of embellishment. He suggested this is how it read, as follows. "At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man. He was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of the people, who received the truth with pleasure, and gained a following both among many Jews and among many of the Greek origin. When Pilate, because of accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, Those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so, and up until this very day the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. Now, however, having mentioned the two historical references, Ehrman says that it's actually not secular history that convinces university professors that Christ actually existed. He said it's actually the Bible itself. Now, this may sound very strange, particularly to an unbeliever, because after all, isn't the Bible, full of fairy tales? I mean, surely non-religious university professors can't be serious, can they? Well, the answer is yes, they are serious. And to understand why, we need to understand the following about the Bible. You see, the Bible, as a collection of books in one book, was not put together until about the 3rd and 4th century. And it actually consists of a collection of independent historical letters and documents that were copied and circulated way back in the 1st century among Christian groups. And besides containing biographies concerning the life of Christ, these documents also contained letters which were sent by early leadership to the congregations. So they consisted of a lot of letters, more than just one author, letters that were written to different congregations that existed in different cities and different countries all around the Mediterranean Sea. And these congregations were actually written to again in the 2nd century by the leaders that existed then. And most people, believe that those leaders existed, that they were really letters. So there's no reason to believe they're not letters. Everything points to the fact that these letters were letters. Even the content. So as such, these professors of ancient history regard these letters and biographies as historical documents, just as they would any other historical document. And the fact that they're religious or contain religious content to an ancient historian is irrelevant. And they say that the fact that they contain extraordinary beliefs and claims and religious bias, Ehrman says, is not the criteria by which professors of ancient history determine that Christ actually existed. That's not the criteria. Also, according to Ehrman, there are 2 points that among professors of ancient history are beyond reasonable doubt. The first is that Christ existed. The second is that Christ was put to death by Pontius Pilate. And there's reasons for this, really good reasons, which I'm going to go into in the next video probably. And by the way, Pontius Pilate has been confirmed not only to exist by Tacitus, who mentioned him, but also archaeology has proved his existence, because there was an inscription that's been dug up that bear his name and the position that he held at that time. Now, there's actually many ways that professors of ancient history determine whether somebody really existed. And I haven't really got time in this video to go through, perhaps the next one, to go through and explain that in detail. But some of those ways involve a knowledge of the language that was spoken at the time, the geography, the culture, the customs, the places, etc., etc. So they take all that into account whether determining whether somebody actually existed. They also take into account the number of independent documents that attest to the person's existence, as well as how long after were the documents written after the person died, and also the content of the documents they really analyze. And Dixon says that there's about 100 peer-reviewed journals dedicated to this subject of Christ's existence. Of course, Ehrman says that there's always going to be people that believe thinly based conspiracy theories, For example, people that believed the Holocaust was a hoax, or the idea that we didn't land on the moon. So for some, no matter what the evidence presented, they're not going to be convinced. But according to Ehrman and Dixon, the consensus among university professors of ancient history and religion is that Christ definitely existed. Well, that's all for now. In the next video, I want to go a bit deeper and explain some of the evidence that convinces professors about the existence of Christ. So until next time, goodbye from Keith James Green's Bible Research.